After Trump and Zelensky had that falling out, a White House official confirmed US military aid to Ukraine was being paused until Trump decided Zelensky is ready for peace. Crucially, that included US intelligence sharing, meaning all the info on Russian forces that the US can gather using satellites and other sensing platforms. As of 12th of March, it seems the aid, including intelligence sharing, was being reinstated after Ukraine accepted US terms. But this video will explore what could have been and what still could be. This was the second time the US stopped its aid. What if it happens again? What if the intelligence sharing ban persists next time? How might Europe's aid try to compensate? And specifically, how much impact will intelligence sharing pause have on Ukraine? Can Europe help in that regard? And how much? And we will go further. What if the rift between Ukraine and the US administration widens so much that even US commercial assets are not allowed to help Ukraine? Watch the video to learn more. This was the second time the US paused aid to Ukraine. First time was from the end of 2023 to spring of 2024, and that pause had some serious consequences, as Ukraine got too low on SAM missiles and artillery shells. Who knows whether there will be another falling out with Trump and whether US aid will once again be cut. Let's see how overall US aid compared to other non-US aid. From January 24, 2022, a month before the war, until December 31, 2024, the US shipped military aid that it valued at $68 billion. All other countries combined have sent military aid that they valued at some $69 billion. Exact values may differ due to the exchange rate being different over time. But the US sent roughly half of the overall military aid. Sent as in physically sent, not just pledged. When one looks at some of the heavy hardware sent to Ukraine, US deliveries versus deliveries from the rest of the world seem fairly small. No combat jets, very few tanks and self-propelled artillery. Of course, the US gave a lot of other military aid. Training, munitions, guided artillery shells, guided rockets, guided anti-tank missiles, and so on. The US sent more artillery shells overall than Europe so far. And like said, US equipment was often valued higher per piece than that of other countries. Still, when it comes to just equipment and ammo, the US contribution has dropped over time. Alexei Melnik, former Ukrainian defense official, said that recent US military aid just before the aid cutoff accounted for around 30% of Ukraine's weapons and ammunition needs. Other 70% is made up from both Ukrainian own production and aid from other countries, with the latter likely taking the biggest share. Europe and other countries could step up and send even more military aid, but that would take time to ramp up production and shipments. Likely months to a year until Ukraine shrinks that 30% gap due to no US aid to 10 or 20%. As said, this whole time Ukraine too has been working on increasing its wartime production. That will help as well. Ukraine had already said they can hold on without US help even right now, though with the cost of some more lives and some more territory lost. Melnik suggested Ukraine can sustain the current levels of fighting capability without US aid for up to 6 months, so some stocks seem to exist, but certain items might be quite time-critical. An Ukrainian official told CNN that artillery shell stocks might run out in 3 to 4 months, after which a reduction in artillery use might happen. Even more critically, Patriot air defense missiles might run out in mere weeks. Those are hard to replace as every Patriot missile shipment must be okayed by the US. The US may or may not block third-party shipments, but the US produces almost all Patriot missiles, with Japan producing a small quantity for its own needs. Crucially, Patriot SAM batteries currently make up the brunt of Ukraine's long-range SAM systems. Without those, large and serious gaps in air defense would appear, and other systems aren't as capable when it comes to anti-ballistic missile defenses. While this military aid pause was brief and had little impact, there's no guarantee another pause won't come in the future, perhaps a much longer one, but equipment pause is just one part of the problem. The US also paused intelligence sharing. It was just for 1 week, but what if it lasts much longer next time? Whenever a US military plane flies near Ukraine, and those had flown almost non-stop up until the pause, they gather data. That data gets processed and relevant info gets passed to Ukraine. All that flying, gathering and processing costs, though it's impossible to say how much the US values it in dollar terms. Similarly, various satellites with optical, radar or signal detection sensors fly over Ukraine constantly. All their data is also processed and relevant info is shared. A lot of those satellites are either US government-owned or US commercial company-owned. The US military, despite having a much bigger spy satellite inventory than Europe, has also been buying imagery from private companies operating satellites. Those purchases have skyrocketed in numbers in the last few years. That's very much visible in contract values. In 2024 and 25, US DoD signed contracts with commercial companies offering Earth imaging services worth some $490 million over the next 5 years. That's on top of a 2023 contract, also 5 years long, worth $190 million, which is on top of $75 million spent from 2018 to 2022. The US then gets intelligence info from purchase sensing data and data from its own satellites. It analyzes it, sends relevant info to Ukraine, and puts a value on its intelligence gathering help. There's also a possibility that the US will keep playing hardball so much that it eventually says, we won't allow US satellite companies selling images of Ukraine and Russia. US companies make up the majority of satellite imagery companies around the world. During this last aid pause, the US already did something similar. It forbade at least one of the big commercial satellite imagery companies, Maxar, from selling images to Ukrainian users. If said intention is expanded, it's possible that unless the US and Ukraine agree on a deal for good, the US might go even further next time, possibly preventing sales of any imagery covering Ukraine's or Russia's territory to anyone who is not the US government. Ukraine could find itself devoid of over 80% of current satellite input. That includes every useful kind of sensing satellite. In the last 2 or 3 years, the US has surged ahead in the number of small-form sensing satellites. Just in 2024, the US launched over 180 sensing satellites, when commercial companies are included. US having 5 to 6 times more satellites means the following in practice. US could have updates of an area, say, every 15 minutes. The EU, if it worked all together, could have an update every hour and a half. Said difference might be enough that Ukraine's forces can't pursue enough time-critical Russian targets, as those could move away during that hour and a half. Spy satellites aren't just optical imagery ones. There are radar-based ones, creating synthetic images, which work even during nighttime or cloudy weather. Thanks to Finnish commercial radar sensing satellites, the EU actually operates a decent number of such satellites. The US tally is imprecise, as it includes secretive Starshield satellites, which are DoD-owned and they very likely feature radars. We chose to focus on European satellites only because other aid-sending nations, like Japan or South Korea, which do have satellites of their own, have for the most part refrained from sending weapons, so targeting information is also unlikely, as it's a more direct kind of combat aid. The US also has many more signals detection satellites, which are important because they can track types and volume of enemy electromagnetic activity, such as communication and radar signals, also leading to tracking Russian troops and leading to better situational awareness. The US also has infrared imaging satellites dedicated to missile detection. That's something which Europe doesn't have at all. Those are useful for detecting not just ICBM launches, like for tracking Oreshnik missiles, but also for smaller missiles like Iskander-M and Kinzhal. Without those, Ukrainian air defenses might have less time to react against Russian ballistic missile attacks, further compounding the lack of Patriot missiles issue. On top of everything else, US data processing is miles ahead of what Europe could do. We already did a video on AI-assisted targeting, using satellite-gathered data and other data. Basically, the US has already used AI-assisted targeting to help Ukraine many times, and overall potential is huge. The same work done with an office of 2,000 people in 2003 can now be done with just 20 people assisted by AI. And there were examples where humans needed hours to find, process, and identify a specific potential target, while the AI did it in under a minute. Basically, overall intelligence sharing that the US has contributed to Ukraine so far has been massive, so much so that if it goes away for good and Ukraine somehow has to rely just on Europe, overall intelligence gathering effort on Russian targets might fall by 90% or more effectively. Sure, France and other countries will be helping Ukraine, but it won't be nearly comparable. We've mentioned the importance of faraway target processing many times since the start of the war, but let's reiterate. Without timely and good recon from satellites and various other spy planes, Ukraine will not be able to hit Russian force concentrations with standoff weapons. No more hitting Russian helicopter bases and air bases brimming with aircraft being prepped for missions. No more hitting air defense sites which change locations. Weapons like the Storm Shadow cruise missile would be less useful. ATACMS, often used on time-critical targets, would be largely useless. Same goes for Gimler's missiles fired from HIMARS when fired at long ranges. Sure, some fixed sites like factories and oil refineries inside Russia could still be hit with long-range drones, but even those might see a more limited effect if no timely info on defenses or factory activity is available. Ukraine's defenses might visibly suffer if Ukraine can't track that well what's going on just 30 or even 50 kilometers away from front lines. Russia could amass more artillery or even whole brigades positioned to try a breakthrough, and Ukraine might not prepare itself to deal with it until those tanks are in firing distance and Russian shells start landing. Certain parts of the front might thus be undermanned and unable to defend against attacks. Basically, without US intelligence sharing, even with all the extra help Europe can bring in, Ukraine will be forced to take an even more defensive stance. It won't be able to react to Russian artillery groupings, missile units, SAM units, nor will it be able to threaten Russian logistics behind the front line. No tracking of battlefield supply depots, logistics lines, and so on. Russian forces would overall be more free to conduct combat ops and be more efficient without a constant threat that has until recently been over their heads. And there is yet another way the US could pressure Ukraine concerning satellites. It could order SpaceX to stop providing Starlink access over Ukraine. Starlink uses a huge satellite constellation to send data to and from small satellite dish terminals used by end users. Ukraine has over the years become quite reliant on Starlink's internet access for communication between headquarters and frontline units, for frontline communication, even for drone navigation and drone piloting. That's another big hit that Ukraine might feel if it happens. Europe's Eutelsat is the only realistic replacement for it, but it's not quite the same service. Eutelsat works in different frequencies and has different coverage, using geostationary satellites as well as low-orbit ones. Basically, Eutelsat could partially replace Starlink, but with serious issues. Low-orbit satellites provide latency, meaning delay, of up to 40 milliseconds. Geostationary satellites suffer 600 millisecond latency, meaning over half a second of delay. For certain drone piloting tasks, that might mean less precise attack drones. Furthermore, Eutelsat terminals are quite expensive at $10,000 each, plus a monthly fee. Starlink so far charged some $600 per terminal, plus monthly fees. There are bound to be far fewer terminals used compared to Starlink. Eutelsat's dishes are larger and more cumbersome, having to deal with geostationary satellites. Basically, the switch would be quite an issue, losing a lot of tactical and battlefield communication advantages that Starlink offered. Ukraine is in a tough place. US intelligence sharing alone is perhaps as worth as the 30% share of military ammo and equipment that the US provided. Certainly, if Ukraine could pick and choose, picking Patriot missiles and intelligence sharing over all the other US help might be a good choice. That's just to illustrate how critical it all may be. Now, much can still change. With Trump, changes are literally impossible to predict, but keep in mind that Ukraine is quite a bit dependent on US military help, especially information and data-wise. And given that the US has stopped aid on 2 occasions now, who's to say it won't happen again? And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.